There's a verse in the Bible that says, this is what the Lord says. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient path. Ask for the good way and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. We're walking the ancient paths and lands of the Bible. We're looking for secrets along the way that can give us that rest for our souls. But these secrets aren't hidden at all. They're actually in plain view. So come with us as we walk the ancient paths and find truth for living for today. The ancient paths have brought us to Caesarea by the Mediterranean, or Caesarea Maritima, as people of the first century would have known it. Herod the Great built the entire city nearly from scratch, and in many ways it was the crown jewel of all his building projects. Caesarea had a theater for drama, another stadium for athletic contests and gladiatorial games. There was a temple for Caesar Augustus and a palace for Herod himself. The city even had a modern sewage system, with the tide of the ocean washing in twice a day with high tide and washing out with all the sewage when the water receded. This was as much a great Roman city as anything you would find in Rome itself. And with the port that Herod built out in the water, a port people said could not be built, well, there were plenty of trips back and forth to Rome. There were a lot of visitors here, including some in the first century church. You think of the book of Acts, the setting of Caesarea was there for Peter to visit Cornelius. There's also a story in the book of Acts of one of Herod's descendants claiming that accolation that the crowd gave him that day, that he was a god. Of all things, well, God had little tolerance for his arrogance, and he died almost instantly. And then, of course, the most famous resident of all, at least for a period of time, was the Apostle Paul. Caesarea might be a beautiful place, but the Bible tells us that Paul was held here against his will for 2 years. Now, he was under house arrest. Perhaps he had a little bit of freedom, but he couldn't travel. He couldn't go plant a church somewhere. He was stuck here. You know, one of his letters actually says, God is able to work all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Well, you'd have to say that God loved Paul and certainly had called him according to His purposes. Wouldn't you like to come back to Caesarea when Paul couldn't leave, when he was frustrated, when he was getting angrier and angrier and the months turned into years, and say, hey, Paul, what kind of good is God bringing from this? And yet 19 centuries have passed, and we can put some pieces of this puzzle together. We can see, for instance, that Paul wrote many of what we call books of the Christian text. They were actually letters, and many of those letters were written in prison. Could some of those letters have been written here? It's possible. Or maybe it even goes beyond that. Maybe Paul, who was always so busy planning churches and meeting people, maybe he needed some time to sit still and to work through the big issues of putting the entire story together of how God had been working through the incredible story of the entire Bible. And what of Luke? Luke was a Gentile friend of Paul's. The journey that brought them to Caesarea from Jerusalem, well, Luke was here, according to Acts. How did Luke get all that information about Jesus? He wrote the Gospel of Luke. He wasn't a disciple. He wasn't an eyewitness. And what about the early church history? He wasn't around for what we like to refer to as Pentecost, the day of the incredible Spirit moving among that first century church. I like to think that Luke may have used this 2-year-long delay to do some investigative reporting. Maybe he went to Bethlehem and talked to some shepherds who had seen the angels. If it hadn't been for Luke's story of that account, we wouldn't know about it. What about the parable of the prodigal son and the other parables that only Luke tells us about? And even the history of the first century church, the book of Acts is our only record of it in the text. If that's all true, then God was working together for good while Paul was in prison here. That's an easy transition to make to today, because there are a lot of times when you and I may be very frustrated by our current circumstances, by whatever is happening in our lives. Maybe we'd even be tempted to say, I don't understand how God could be working for good in what's going on right now. Our God is so good, is so powerful, that in every situation, He is certainly able to work good for those who love Him and are called according to His purposes. Never forget that. Never forget your hope, and know for sure that God is in control. I'm Andy Cook for the Christian Television Network.